Tonight's video is about climate. This will be the last notes for our weather and climate unit before we start our climate change project next week. So we're going to start by defining climate, how it's different than weather, and go into the factors that affect climate. So climate is the average long-term conditions of temperature, precipitations, winds, and clouds. Basically, it's the average weather in an area. Weather is short-term, climate is long-term. So climate we can define in our notes as the average long-term weather conditions. And we define climate based on temperature and precipitation. So the climate for a particular region is defined by the temperature of that region and how much precipitation it gets. So let's take a look at some factors that would affect the temperature and precipitation. We'll start with temperature. So these are factors affecting temperature. There we go. I can spell. All right, so factors affecting temperature. So there's some of them are pretty straightforward, right? And the most basic is latitude. Closer to the equator equals hotter. Right? And then that's kind of instinctively we know that, right? If you're close to the equator, like these green areas here, that's considered to be a tropical zone. The red areas are considered to be subtropical. That's where we are here in Atlanta, right about there. Farther up is what we would call the tempered or temperate zone. And then way near the poles is what we would consider the cold or polar zone. So latitude obviously has a big effect on the temperature in a region. Next big thing is altitude. Right? Higher altitudes are generally colder. And we know this because as you go up in the troposphere, it gets colder. So a city that's located at 3,000 meters above sea level, which is roughly 12,000 feet, is going to be a lot colder than a city at 100 meters above sea level. And Atlanta's at about 200 to 300 meters above sea level. I don't remember the exact number. But we're pretty low, whereas Denver is at a mile above sea level. So they have a little bit colder climate than we do. All right, two more. The distance from water. Right? So places closer to water don't change temperature during seasons or between seasons. So we know that water heats and cools much more slowly than land does. So a place close to the water isn't going to change temperature as much between winter and summer because the water will help to kind of make that temperature difference a little bit less extreme. So somewhere on the coast would have a pretty mild winter and a pretty cool summer. Somewhere in the middle of the country would have a much hotter summer and have a much colder winter. And the last thing is ocean currents, and these can bring either warm or cold water off the coast. And depending on the current, if it brings warm water, it'll make the temperature warmer. Cold water will make the temperature colder. So, for example, England, right, is farther north than pretty much all of the United States. It's on the same latitude as Canada, but because this warm ocean current brings all this warm water offshore, their temperatures are not as cold in the winter as temperatures are in Canada. Okay. So that's factors that affect temperature. So now let's look at precipitation. All right, we've got a couple factors that affect precipitation. All right, the first one is the prevailing winds. All right, these are, again, our polar easterlies, prevailing westerlies, or trade winds, and then they can bring either moisture or dry air depending on our location. Right? So if you're at somewhere where the prevailing westerlies are blowing from the ocean to the land, you're going to get more moisture than somewhere where those prevailing winds are blowing over land and not bringing more moisture. Another thing is what are called seasonal winds. All right, and you guys have probably learned about the monsoon in geography. If you haven't, you will. This is basically a giant sea and land breeze, and so seasonal differences in temperature create huge sea and land breezes, bringing humid or dry air. All right, that's a little bit long, I know, for our notes, but if we look at this picture, during the summer, the land over India gets really hot and creates a huge sea breeze that brings all this moisture in off the Indian Ocean. In the winter, the land is much colder, so it has higher pressure, and this air blows out to sea, therefore drying everything out. So in India, you'll have months where it rains almost every day, and then in the winter, you'll have months where it will not rain. And so their precipitation is very, very seasonal. And our last factor that's going to affect precipitation is mountains. All right, and you guys may have learned about the rain shadow effect in geography. All right, mountains force air upwards, where it cools and precipitation happens. And this forms what we call a rain shadow desert on the far side of the mountains. Right? You can see here in this picture, wind blows towards the mountains. As that air gets forced upwards by the mountains, it cools, so we get a lot of condensation and precipitation on the one side of the mountain. By the time that air gets over the mountain, it has no more water vapor, and so it's very dry. And a big example of this is, again, in India. You have the Himalayan mountains right here. You can see them in the picture. Winds come up from the south, following my mouse. As they come up here, they hit the Himalayas, they get pushed upwards, and you can see how green India is because all of this moisture falls on this side of the mountains. On the back side of the mountains, all that moisture is gone, so you have a big desert. And that is all there is that determines climate. All right? Please make sure you write a good summary and fill out the survey. And next week we will start looking at climate change and how these climates can change over time.